Good morning, everyone, or people watching from other continents. Good evening, good afternoon. My name is John Connolly. I'm the director of the Institute for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies here at UC Berkeley, and it's my great privilege to introduce to you Professor Ulf Brunnbauer, who will be speaking to us this morning. Just a few words on Ulf's background. He's a social historian of Southeastern Europe. He received his training at the University of Graz. He has worked on both what we would consider to be Russian and as well as East European history, so he has a broad background. He's currently the director of the Leibniz Institute for East and Southeast European Studies in Regensburg and holds the chair of Southeast and East European history also at that university. His most recent book, co-authored with Philippe Ter and others, can people see this? That's a very, very nice format, which I had the pleasure myself of reading recently, is a study of the transformation using the example of two shipyards from the 1970s. It's called In den Stürmen der Transformation, the storms of transformation, came out this year. And Ulf is also the author of Globalizing Southeastern Europe, Emigrants, America, and the States since the 19th Century. And his topic this morning for us is congealed labor conserved fish from the Adriatic towards a global history of the canned sardine from the 19th century till now. So would you please welcome Professor Ulf Brunnbauer.
Thanks, John, for this kind introduction. Thanks also to you coming, or to the Zoom audience, and bearing with me. I guess I should start with the disclaimer. What I'm going to present today is more the result of a hobby or pet project. I mean, I can claim that at least one journal article in a halfway decent journal came out, but I still don't know whether it's relevant or big enough for a book project. And this is why I really am dependent also on critical feedback from the audience. And if you tell me that this is just nuts, then I will leave it as a pet project and not continue thinking whether this could be a bigger story. In a way, it came out from this book project that John just mentioned on the history of two shipyards, or the history of maritime industries. And it seems that I'm turning from the largest thing, movable thing that humans are building, which is ships, to a very small one, which is the canned sardine. But at least as one of the respondents of one of the canneries I started told me recently, at least there's still demand for the sardine can in Istria, whereas there's no demand anymore for the shipyard that used to be there, which we studied, which is also discomforting for me, because during our project, when we did the research on the shipyards, they went bankrupt and ceased production. And I do sincerely fear that also there won't be a very happy ending to this story, which I'm going to present today briefly. I thought we could use some uplifting stories about the sardines, not talking about war, which we will do on Monday anyway in this context. Thanks also to the hosts. I think it's not totally accidental that the Center for Portuguese Studies appears here as well, because basically when you talk about sardine canning, that's very much a Portuguese story, and they will refer to that briefly. Fish can be very political and even trigger interstate disputes, because fish have a proclivity to ignore boundaries, borders that are drawn in water. The Brexit talks almost failed because of dispute over fishing rights. Even more seriously, the United Kingdom and Iceland fought the Cod War since the late 1950s, when Iceland started to extend its territorial waters. A dispute that reached the United Nations Security Council, a dispute in which the navies of these two countries almost shelled each other, and which led Iceland severing its relations with the UK, and NATO at the end intervening, and also the United States putting pressure on Great Britain to accept Iceland's claims. The United States was involved in a tuna war with Peru and Ecuador, also starting in the 1950s, when these two countries began to extend their territorial waters. A war that involved the arrest of US fishing ships by Peru and Ecuador, that led to the severance of military and financial subsidies from the US to these two countries. Peru kicked out the US military mission. It was quite a quite serious dispute about tuna. Another war, if you could say, was waged by European settlers over salmon against Native Americans in North America. The exploitation of salmon and then the establishment of salmon canneries was one of the major reasons why non-native settlements appeared in the first place along the Pacific coast, with devastating consequences for the native populations. The Sardine also had its 15 minutes of political fame in California, so I thought to throw in some local history. In 1938, there was the ballot initiative put before voters in California, which proposed to introduce new measures to protect sardine stocks. It was motivated by a very curious development, or you could say one of the nice examples of the ingenuity of American capitalism to avoid regulations. So I quote from the argument in favor of this proposition. Several years ago, certain persons conceived the idea of placing reduction plants, that is, plants to produce fish oil and fish meal, and fish was one of the major fertilizers at that time, on all ships and moving them just beyond the 3-mile limit to escape restrictions of the Californian laws and to avoid payment of taxes. So at that time, there was the idea that the territorial waters would extend only 3 miles beyond the coast. And these plants on the sea, on the open sea, encouraged unregulated fishing, which in turn threatened to destruct the sardine stocks before the Californian coast, which was, as the proponents of the initiative argued, the most important and most valuable commercial and food fishery in California. The initiative passed. 10 years later, there was another initiative involving the sardine after a 400% decline in sardine catches before Californian waters. This time it was about the prohibition of certain nets, the purse seine net, especially, which helps to fish a more enormous amount of sardines and all kinds of bycatch. So the proposers argued that their measure would preserve Californians, I quote, multi-million-dollar commercial fishing industry and also its multi-million-dollar sports fishing industry. The adversaries argued, no, in contrast, it would destroy a great industry, a tremendous annual food supply of low-cost, high-quality protein. Thousands of cannery workers and fishermen would lose their income. And they made an argument eerily similar to today's climate denialists. I quote again, an initiative controlling a natural resource is basically unsound. Ocean fishery is subject to great natural changes in abundance yearly with periodical good and bad crops, even without man's interference. The measure failed, but anyway, the sardine had disappeared from Californian waters for good by the late 1940s. So what connects these examples is the usability of fish, of the fish in question for conservation. Salmon, tuna, sardine are put into conserves and can be shipped around the world and basically last forever. Cod is salted or dried and then turned into delicious bacalhau dishes, one of the major specialities in Portugal, but also sometimes in areas far away from the sea. So the exploitation and consumption of these species of fish allows us to see how global capitalism and globalization work. In the book, A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, Raj Patel and Jason W. Moore argue that capitalism in its quest for cheapness exists only through frontiers and, I quote, expanding from one place to the next, transforming socio-ecological relations, producing more and more kinds of goods and services that circulate through an expanding series of exchanges. The oceans obviously one such important frontier. They have been seen by capitalism as a free gift, these two authors argue. And I think we can agree that commodities are not only congealed labor time, which is what Karl Marx told us, but also congealed nature. I'm only a modest historian of Southeastern Europe, and the history that I draw comes from a very small region, Istria, just to give you an idea where it is. Quite interesting region, actually, because it's one of these paradigmatic contact zones, often disputed, changing borders, changing political regimes. The region also, of course, at the frontier of major ideological disputes, different cultural influences. I'm happy if I can frame my small stories in ways that link them to global development, or at least to pretend to do so. At the same time, I'm also hesitant to quickly explain away local specificities and paint historical developments in unicolor ways. When you zoom in on lived experiences on the small scale, things usually get a bit more complicated. Global forces manifest themselves in very different ways, depending on always specific local contexts. To put it differently, local actors can modify the vectors of change. How depends on which resources are available to them. So the story of the Sardine is certainly one of industrial exploitation. True enough, this is also a story of cheap labor, of cheap nature, of cheap food and so on, also in Southeastern Europe, my area of expertise, or the wider Mediterranean context. But it is also a story of development, of social advancement, of modernization, of worker struggles, and of local pride for a product that is healthy, affordable, and ubiquitous. The history that comes out of the sardine can, once you open it, is not only one about environmental and social degradation, but also one about visions of the future and about world making. So let's hear from a respondent that I interviewed in Rovinj, working for the Mirna company, one of these well-established canneries there. So just few excerpts. The problem started in the 1990s, especially when the dolphins appeared. There are so many dolphins. There's so much frightened the fishing with sardines that you couldn't eat, you can't eat your own. In earlier times, we worked a lot for Kuwait and for Iran, referring to the socialist period. We were trained in a different system. We were more Western educated because we were sometime before that under Venetian rule, then under Austria for 180 years, and so on. So it's a very, very, very sort of diverse, ambiguous, but also multi-folded story that he tells, in which experiences of an empire, of nature, of business, of work intersect in multifold ways. So producing fish cans links people to the wider world and makes their relevant spaces of interaction very different from those the government imposes on them. So let me try to disentangle these relations. First things first, the sardine canning, production of other, but it's mainly sardines, came to the Upper Adriatic in the 1870s when these coasts belonged to the Habsburg Empire. Many of the first cannery businesses were established by French entrepreneurs, other by Austrian businessmen, especially from Trieste, which was the major Austrian port, and becoming also an industrial center in the late 19th century, but also from the inland. In the town of Rovinj, my case study, the first cannery was established by a French firm in 1882. Until the outbreak of World War I, almost 30 fish canneries were established along what we nowadays would call the Slovenian and Croatian coast, then belonging to different parts of the Austrian, of Cisleitania, the Austrian half of the Habsburg Empire. The boom in the canning business was also related to the building of railways. So by the 1870s, places like Trieste, Fiume were connected to the Austro-Hungarian and therefore the European railway system, making the transportation of cans to Vienna, Prague, Budapest, and beyond cheap, fairly cheap and quick. And this was important because the consumers of canned fish were not the local populations. At the coast, they would eat fresh fish. And the inland people in what used to be Yugoslavia, they don't eat much fish anyway. So they were shipped to other parts of the Habsburg Empire and also exported. The important role of French entrepreneurs is no coincidence. It was a Frenchman, Nicolas Appert, who in 1795 invented the modern preservation of food by sterilization and putting food into first glass and then tin cans that were hermetically sealed. The first fish cannery appeared in Nantes, in the Bretagne, in 1822, model here. From there, the business quickly expanded along the French coast, helped also by new railway connections. By 1880, French boosted already 160 factories for canned sardines, employing thousands of workers and securing a livelihood for thousands of fishermen. The boom, though, didn't last long, because by the end of the 19th century, for reasons that we don't know exactly, the sardine disappeared before the French coast. So French capital from this business moved to places like the Adriatic, helping to kickstart the development of fish canning industries there, but also to Portugal, and helping to turn Portugal into what then by 1910 would be the most important export of canned sardines and other fish in the world. And it continues to be an important industry there. In the upper Adriatic, apart from French business, Austrian businessmen played an important role. Obviously, one important, so to throw in also Bohemian dimension, one important and interesting figure was a certain Karl Marx, who was born in Bohemia in 1829, and again proving that Shakespeare was right, that Bohemia also has coast. He received training in Vienna, traveled as a salesman, got to Marseille, where I also saw a cannery business, and then transposed this idea to Austria and established a couple of canneries along the Austrian coast and also inland Austria, also in Vienna, where he was then appointed imperial purveyor to the court of canned sardines. His Vienna business, or his Austrian business, survived into the 1980s and 1990s, producing all kinds of canned and preserved fish. Why could they do that? Because they used migrant labor, cheap migrant labor, most of them from the former Yugoslavia. Women, Gastarbeiter women from socialist Yugoslavia. So we have already arrived at the second law of sardine canning. The first one being that you need sardines. And the second one is that almost everywhere the workforce is predominantly female. This is also, at least for the American story, quite well studied. Karl Marx has also made clear that commodities are the products of class relations. So a can of sardines is also a case in point. Work in a fish cannery was and still is hard and poorly paid. Workers faced noise and an unsavory stench. Work was also often seasonal, at least in this earlier times, so pay irregular, so that workers had to find alternatives during the period of no fish landings or depended on the wages of other family members. For this reason, it was very often, it was not very, almost always marginalized labor that filled the shop floor of a cannery, be it in California, British Columbia, France, Portugal, Germany, Morocco, or Istria. This also means that the structure of the cannery shop floor gives you a fair picture of patterns of marginalization and inequality. So unsurprisingly, for example, in America, in California, where canning of fish and of vegetables became a major business, it was marginalized immigrant groups that filled the shop floor, first Chinese, later Japanese and Italian, and then Mexican, Philippine, and so on, very often women. In Europe, it was almost exclusively a female workforce that filled the shop floor. So workers working on the shop or doing the actual canning almost exclusively women at that time when there were few, well, not any other paid jobs for them available along the coast. In the case study that I studied a little bit in more detail in Rovin, in Istria, was also an interesting ethnic component to this pattern. Istria, until the 1940s, so until into the late 1940s, when finally was joined to Yugoslavia, had a large Italian population, especially the towns were predominantly Italians, also Rovinj. Women filled the workforce of the tobacco factory, which still exists, whereas Croat or Slavic women worked in the canneries, and unsurprisingly, the latter carried the least prestige. The predominance of female labor continued throughout the socialist period. 80–90% of the workforce were women, also for reasons that very often they were the only workforce that could be recruited into this kind of not very pleasant job. So there is a pattern when it comes to the workforce, but family resemblance does not mean sameness. So in a collaborative project with ethnologists in Ljubljana, we interviewed former female workers of fish canneries in today's Slovenia and Croatia. Many of them spoke in a very nostalgic tone about work in the cannery and also about the work-based community under Yugoslav socialism. Some of them came from the country's interior and found work in a cannery a liberating experience from their patriarchal families that they had left behind. So how come that work in such apparently unpleasant work is remembered so fondly? I think we can exclude the possibility that fish offal smelled better under communism. Cleaning the fish, putting it into cans, piling cans was also very hard, manual and demanding, physically demanding work in a socialist factory. Nevertheless, it is how socialism, especially in its Yugoslav variety, managed such low-skilled, humble jobs. This is, I think, where you really can see significant differences between socialist and the capitalist shop floor. Unskilled workers received a lot of recognition and felt acknowledged as a valuable part of society. In Yugoslav context, self-management neither led to workers' democracy or workers' factory control, but it helped to build affective communities around the workplace. Factories provided ample social welfare and opportunities for diverse activities, and the cannery in Rovinj made no exception. A photo album from the Mirna factory is full of pictures of working women. Many photos depict celebrations and training events indicating their crucial function in creating a shop floor community. Of course, a few pictures, really they're not so few, but quite many, a few pictures don't tell a social history, but what is really conspicuous in these photos is the confident expression of most of the women, although not of the Miss Sardelle when she had the dubious privilege of the first dance at the firm's annual anniversary celebration. Sardelle in Croatian means Sardine. So at least in the Yugoslav context, cannery work was also one of local experiences of economic and social advancement. I do not know enough about Portuguese history, but from what I see, at least from the visual representation of the canning business of sardine canning under Salazar, that is in a semi-fascist right-wing dictatorship, it does look quite similar to representations of socialist industrialization. Salazar, by the way, was also a big promoter of the sardine, which in the 1930s, sardine cans were Portugal's single most important export product. So at least in the visual representation, that's kind of a coffee table book from the late 1930s that appeared in different languages and was designed by one of the most important Portuguese graphic designers of these days. So at least in the representation, in the official representation, canneries were presented as nuclei of modernization in areas previously untouched by industrialization. And incidentally, it was a form of industrialization that was tightly embedded in existing local economic and resource extraction patterns, linking fish, the making of olive oil, and vegetable production. And this embeddedness might also help to explain its resilience. Resilience is the last theme that I want to briefly highlight. The factory that I studied and also other canneries in Istria withstood quite an amount of political or historical rupture. So the Mirna factory is about to celebrate its 100th birthday in 2 years, which is quite an achievement in a region where not very many enterprises have such a long history. Istria has changed hands in the 20th century from Austria to Italy, then to brief German occupation during World War II and Allied control until 1947, when it was finally joined with Yugoslavia, and now being, of course, part of independent Croatia, which in turn in 2013 entered the European Union, which brought another substantial change in the macroeconomic structures. So the survival strategy of a business or adaptation strategy of a business can elucidate not only the local implications of such big changes, but also the agency of local actors who developed their own strategies of resilience. And a good example actually is this small, it was not so small cannery in Rovinj. For example, after World War II, when Istria became part of, or most of it became part of Yugoslavia, they faced the problem that all their important trade relations were interrupted. They had had depended on supplies of fish, of tin, of other materials, olive oil, tomatoes from Italy, or also from other Mediterranean countries, which now all belong to the camp on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Their consumers were located in Austria, in Germany, in the United States, in Czechoslovakia, which severed its relations with Yugoslavia in 1948. And what you see from the business documentation, not much of it has survived, unfortunately, which is one of the problems of studying small businesses, not only in such a context, but in general, that very often the firm archives just have not survived, which also helps to explain why business history is such a bias towards large firms. But from the surviving documentation, you do see systematic lobbying efforts from below towards the government or the different levels of governments in Yugoslavia to liberalize foreign trade and to provide support for exports. So when Yugoslavia eventually decided to switch to an export-led development strategy in the late 1950s, which was a move that was also caused by this demand from below, from firms. This also put an export-oriented business like the Mirna cannery in a very good position to ask for government subsidies. So in the 1960s, 1970s, they managed really to build an empire of fish, employing 2,000 people directly, and of course being really very crucial for the local economy. What they also did is, just for those who have an interest, I don't know whether this moves on its own, in the economic history of socialism, they pursued one of the strategies that you very often find when you study socialist businesses, which is insourcing. So exactly opposite what a business management handbook would tell you, because in order to become less dependent on unreliable suppliers, they would produce as much as possible their own. So starting from the cans, the packaging, running their own fleet, fishing fleet, having their own shipyard, and so on. And they diverged in very different businesses, producing all kinds of ready-made meals, and also being one of the first actually firms worldwide that started to farm fish, sea bass, and gilthead. So you do see a lot also of ingenuity possible under the conditions of socialist economy. They were also helped in the 1980s when Yugoslav economy basically almost collapsed by a record sardine catches in the Adriatic. Yeah, post-socialist history is also quite curious. Shady privatization in the 1990s, but then being bought by the largest Croatian food conglomerate, Podravka, and still surviving. Industrialization had come to Croatia in the 19th century mainly in the form of food processing. And this appears to be still one of the country's few viable industries today. Food also radiates a sense of locality and authenticity that can add an extra dose of resilience in the face of global market pressures. This is where the French, of course, excel by praising the value of terroir, which extends also to the sardines. Mm-hmm. As the Mirna people say, I quote from a brochure that appeared in the late 1980s, the Adriatic sardine, or the mala plava riba, as they call them, the small blue fish, is of special delicacy and extraordinary flavor, better than those from the oceans. It is the basis for the superfood from the Adriatic, which is one of the current slogans. So let me briefly conclude. Coming back to California first. In Monterey, which you probably have visited, Cannery Row today exists only as a tourist attraction, which has, as per of its website, memorable experiences for the history buff, which is probably us, the shopping enthusiast, the food fanatic, and also the nature lover. Its memory is also kept alive by John Steinbeck's immortal novel of the same name, and there's also a sequel, of course, Sweet Thursday. In Monterey and also on many Adriatic islands as well, tourism has won the dispute who can exploit the shoreline against canneries. In a really quite masterful book, Connie Chang has analyzed the intersection between class and ethnicity on the case of the struggle between cannery operators and tourism managers in Monterey since the late 19th century. Both of these industries appeared there. And ultimately, even the business acumen of the local cannery owners could not overcome the revenge of nature. Sardines just disappeared from California by the end of the 1940s. For reasons, overfishing played a role, but probably not the most significant one. This had disastrous effects on the cannery workers in Monterey, which of course disappeared. But hotel managers were very happy that their upper class guests would not complain about the stench coming from the canneries anymore. The collapse of what used to be the sardine capital of the world heralded the disappearance of the fish cannery industry from North American soil. The last cannery in the United States closed in 2010. And a lot of American, actually also machinery, moved south to low-cost countries like Peru, for example. Mirna and a couple of other canneries along the Croatian and Slovenian coast still operate, but they're also finding it increasingly difficult. One of the growing difficulties is to recruit workers in a region where tourism offers much higher wages than work in the cannery, and where many people, also thanks to socialism, own one or two properties which they can rent out in the summer. Last time, when this factory tried to introduce in 2018 a second shift, they had to recruit workers from the depressed inland regions of Croatia and also from Bosnia. Another cannery operator on Dalmatian Island, he decided to move his business to Niš in Serbia, where of course there are no sardines, but there's a lot of cheap labor. In Portugal and French, canneries embarked on a strategy of upscaling, producing not only very tasty, but also nicely marketed and nicely packaged cans, and asking much higher prices, because that's the only way how to withstand Moroccan competition. Morocco became the sort of cannery producer of default. So when you go to Whole's Food here in Berkeley, the sardine cans that you would get, they have a nice fancy name, but they're all produced in Morocco. Yet there's an even more substantial threat to the sardine canning business in the Adriatic, which has to do with the volatility of the sardine and climate change. namely rising seawater temperature. Because of their biological characteristics, small pelagic fish like the sardine, the anchovy, or the herring, which represent about of a quarter of the total annual world fishery catch, they are highly sensitive to environmental forces and extremely variable in their abundance. Sardines can spawn only in a very limited range of water temperature and salinity levels. And these conditions are maintained in the Adriatic. They're very peculiar. I mean, the Adriatic is almost more of a lake than a sea. It's certainly not an ocean. And there's a very peculiar current system with a southward current along the Italian coast that brings cooler and less salinity water because it is fed by the rivers like the Po that enter into the Adriatic, and the northward current on the Croatian coast bringing warmer water from the Ionian Sea. And in between, this is exactly the water the sardine needs to spawn. But because of climate change, temperature levels are rising, and you really can see it with your own eyes. This year, for example, already in June, water temperature in the upper Adriatic was 26, 27 degrees. So climate change destroys this sensitive balance. And as a result, sardines are beginning to disappear from the Adriatic and also from the whole Mediterranean, and are replaced by tropical and subtropical fish species, whereas they're becoming abundant in the North Sea. So maybe that's the scenario for sardine. First, for the sardine canning business to become a memory in the Adriatic, and there are already some memorials commemorating past sardine canneries, but it could also be a chance for the United Kingdom to live up to its post-Brexit global credentials, becoming the new sardine capital in the world. Thank you.